You don't have to manipulate people. You don't have to lie. You don't have to do all of those things to, where you win and somebody loses. Everybody can win. Don't make him pay forever for a debt that grace has already paid.
What happens when one of the world's most famous prosperity preachers stands before his own congregation and admits that one of the teachings that built his empire was wrong? For decades, Pastor Creflo Dollar told millions that faith in giving could unlock God's blessings. His ministry grew from a tiny school cafeteria into a global empire worth millions. But then the questions started coming. First came the luxury, then the investigations, then the headlines. Then came a stunning confession that left supporters, critics, and even longtime followers asking the same question. If this teaching was wrong, what does that mean for everything that came before it? And strangely enough, that wasn't even the biggest challenge his ministry would face, because the deeper we look into Creflo Dollar's rise, the more one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Things aren't looking good, and the real story is only just beginning. The first few years of Creflo Dollar's ministry were defined by something many churches struggled to achieve: steady, explosive growth. Week after week, more people filled the seats. His message was simple enough for almost anyone to understand. God wanted believers to live with hope, purpose, and victory, not defeat. For families weighed down by debt, uncertainty, and disappointment, that message felt deeply personal. As the congregation expanded, so did Dollar's vision. In 1991, the ministry became World Changers Church International, a name that reflected ambitions reaching far beyond Atlanta. Soon, his sermons moved from the church stage to radio and television, where the program Changing Your World introduced his teachings to millions across the United States, Africa, Europe, and other parts of the world. What had started with just 8 people was becoming an international movement. Then came the prosperity message, the teaching that would define his ministry for decades. Dollar taught that faith, speaking God's promises, and generous giving could open the door to financial blessing and personal breakthrough. To many supporters, he wasn't simply preaching about money, he was offering hope to people who believed their circumstances could change through faith. The growth was impossible to ignore. A massive sanctuary known as the World Dome opened its doors, seating thousands of worshipers. Attendance climbed into the tens of thousands, and the ministry expanded through conferences, books, broadcasts, and churches in multiple countries. But with every new milestone came something else. The larger the ministry became, the more people began looking beyond the sermons. Some celebrated what they believed was evidence of God's blessing. Others started asking whether success on such a scale could exist without difficult questions. Those questions would soon shift from the ministry itself to the man standing behind the pulpit. As World Changers Church International continued to grow, Creflo Dollar's success became impossible to separate from his message. To his supporters, his life was living proof that the principles he preached actually worked. But to others, the growing display of wealth raised a different question. At what point does success begin to overshadow the message itself? The contrast was striking. The young man who once preached in a school cafeteria now lived on a sprawling estate outside Atlanta. His real estate portfolio expanded to include luxury homes worth millions of dollars. High-end vehicles became part of his public image, and private air travel became a regular part of his ministry. Dollar argued that the demands of a global schedule made private aviation a practical necessity, not a symbol of excess. His supporters agreed, pointing to an international ministry that reached millions every year. But critics saw something different. As his lifestyle became more visible, so did the debate surrounding it. Many questioned whether a pastor should display such extraordinary wealth while speaking to congregations filled with families facing financial hardship. To supporters, these blessings reflected God's favor. To skeptics, they reflected a growing distance between the preacher and the people listening to him. Even his surname seemed to invite discussion. Dollar had always been his family name, but as his prosperity message spread across the world, some observers began treating that coincidence as an ironic symbol of the larger debate surrounding his ministry. The man behind the message was slowly becoming the message itself. And as public attention shifted from his sermons to his lifestyle, another issue quietly emerged, one that had little to do with mansions or luxury cars and everything to do with transparency. Because the next questions weren't about how much he owned, they were about who was asking to see the books. By the late 2000s, Creflo Dollar had become one of the most recognizable televangelists in the world. His books were selling, his broadcasts reached millions, and his ministry had expanded across several countries. But as his influence grew, so did the number of people asking a different kind of question. It wasn't simply about how much money the ministry received. It was about how much the public was allowed to know. Watchdog organizations that evaluated nonprofit ministries criticized World Changers Church International for its limited financial transparency. Some gave the ministry poor ratings, arguing that audited financial records were not publicly available in the same way they were for many other charities. Dollar defended that position, maintaining that the ministry was accountable to God and its own governance, not to outside organizations demanding access to internal records. Then, the attention grew even larger. Between 2007 and 2011, the United States Senate Finance Committee examined the financial practices of several high-profile televangelists, including Creflo Dollar. The investigation sought information about ministry finances and whether donated funds had been used appropriately. Although the inquiry generated national headlines, it ultimately ended without criminal charges against Dollar. Legally, the investigation closed. Publicly, however, the conversation did not. For many supporters, the absence of charges confirmed their belief that the criticism had gone too far. For others, the investigation left unanswered questions about accountability and financial openness that continued to follow the ministry long after the headlines faded. The scrutiny changed something important. The discussion was no longer centered on what Creflo Dollar preached. It was increasingly centered on whether people trusted the system surrounding his ministry. And just when it seemed that debate couldn't become any louder, one announcement would spark a global backlash that reached far beyond church walls, because this time, the price tag alone made international news. For years, Creflo Dollar had defended his success by saying that God's blessings should never be hidden. His supporters believed his growing ministry required growing resources. His critics believed the line between ministry and luxury had become increasingly difficult to see. Then, in 2015, one announcement turned that debate into an international story. The project was called Project G650. Dollar asked supporters to help purchase a Gulfstream G650, one of the most advanced private jets in the world, with a price tag of around $65 million. He explains that his existing aircraft had experienced dangerous mechanical problems over the years, including engine issues during one flight and landing complications during another. According to Dollar, commercial airlines simply could not support the pace of a ministry that operated across multiple continents. His request was direct. If 200,000 people each gave $300, the aircraft could be purchased without placing the burden on just a few donors. To many faithful supporters, the vision made sense. They believed a global ministry required reliable transportation and saw the aircraft as a tool for reaching more people. But outside the ministry, the reaction was immediate. Critics questioned whether one of the world's most expensive business jets was truly necessary. Aviation experts challenged some of the public claims made about the aircraft's humanitarian capabilities, while social media. Police responded to Dollar's home in Fayette County, Georgia, after an argument involving his 15-year-old daughter. According to police reports, she accused her father of physically assaulting her during a disagreement. The allegations quickly spread across national news, placing one of America's best-known pastors under an entirely different kind of spotlight. Dollar strongly disputed the most serious accusations. He acknowledged that he had restrained his daughter during the confrontation, but denied choking or punching her. He maintained that the situation had been exaggerated and said the marks described in reports were not caused in the way they had been portrayed. The legal process moved quickly. Dollar was arrested and charged, but the case later took a different direction. After completing a court-approved anger management program, the charges were dismissed, bringing the legal matter to a close. Yet public opinion proved far more difficult to settle. Some supporters believed the incident had been unfairly amplified by the media and pointed to the dismissal of the charges as evidence that the story had been blown out of proportion. Others argued that regardless of the legal outcome, the episode raised uncomfortable questions about leadership, accountability, and the pressure placed on public figures whose personal lives become national news. For the first time, many people weren't just evaluating Creflo Dollar's message, they were evaluating his character. And while that debate continued, an even more surprising development was quietly taking shape, one that would force millions to reconsider nearly everything they thought they knew about the ministry he had spent decades building. Because the greatest challenge to Creflo Dollar's legacy wasn't coming from a courtroom or a television headline, it was about to come from his own pulpit. After decades of building one of the world's most recognizable prosperity ministries, Creflo Dollar did something few public religious leaders ever do. He told his congregation he had been wrong. Not about a small detail, not about a passing comment, about one of the very teachings that had helped define his ministry for generations. During a sermon in 2022, Dollar surprised supporters by declaring that his previous teaching on mandatory tithing was not correct. He urged people to throw away his older books, DVDs, and sermons on the subject, explaining that Christians live under God's grace rather than the requirements of Old Testament law. Giving, he now said, should come from a willing heart, not from fear, obligation, or the expectation of financial rewards. The announcement sent shockwaves far beyond his church. For some believers, it was an extraordinary act of humility. They admired a pastor willing to publicly admit that his understanding had changed, even knowing it could cost him relationships, speaking invitations, and influence within circles that had long embraced prosperity teaching. Others saw something very different. If one of his most influential teachings had been wrong, they wondered what did that mean for the millions of people who had followed it for years. Some critics even asked whether those who had donated based on those earlier teachings deserved some form of restitution. Dollar did not announce any refund program and explained that his earlier teaching reflected where he was in his spiritual journey. He also made it clear that while his understanding had changed, he did not believe an apology was necessary because he viewed the change as growth rather than deception. Yet one thing remained unchanged. Dollar still encouraged generosity. The difference, he said, was why people should give, not because they were under a law, but because they were responding to grace. For some, that distinction marked spiritual maturity. For others, it reopened decades of unanswered questions. And as the dust settled, one final question remained. How would history remember the man whose greatest challenge ultimately came from rewriting the message that made him famous? Looking back, it is easy to focus on one controversy and miss the larger story. But Creflo Dollar's journey was never shaped by a single headline. It was a series of turning points, each one changing how people viewed the man, his ministry, and the message that made him famous. He began as a young preacher with 8 people gathered inside a school cafeteria. He built one of the largest ministries in America. His broadcasts reached millions around the world. His teachings influenced churches across continents. For many families, his sermons offered hope during difficult times. Supporters still point to lives they believe were transformed through his ministry, and many continue to stand by him today. They see a pastor who has remained committed to sharing the gospel, even when doing so meant publicly changing his own theological position. But others see the story differently. They point to the luxury lifestyle, the questions about financial transparency, the Senate investigation, the private jet controversy, the family incident, and finally, the dramatic shift away from one of the central teachings that helped build his ministry. To them, these moments are not isolated events. They are chapters in a larger story that continues to shape his public legacy. Perhaps the biggest irony is this. For years, Creflo Dollar challenged millions to rethink what they believed about faith, finances, and God's promises. Then, one day, he stood before those same people and admitted that he had changed what he believed. That moment may become the defining chapter of his entire ministry. Because the biggest question isn't whether Creflo Dollar built an extraordinary empire. It's whether history will remember him for building it, or for becoming the man who publicly rewrote the message that built it. And perhaps the answer to that question hasn't been written yet.